This is the book of Jonah, an exegesis of verses 4 through 6, as we continue looking at some of the information and details about the structure and background on these verses and this portion of the book of Jonah, continuing from what we looked at last time, where the focus was on Jonah's disobedience. So we took a look at some of the structural markers and information, and prayerfully we can do the same today to help us have a better understanding of what's going on in the text. For preparation as you study and do your own research for a sermon or a Bible study, or if you're just looking to delve in deeper in the details of this interesting and important book. So what we see here, let's start off just with the first phrase in the English. Once again, I'm using the ESV. You may have a different translation, but the ESV reads, "But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea." And it starts off in the Hebrew with essentially Va Yahweh. So what you see here, this is the word Yahweh for the divine name. It's God's name. And it starts off with the Vav consecutive again. So it's the Vav or the Wow, as we mentioned last time, with this vowel pointing underneath it. And usually the way that's translated, it's indicating that there's sequence. So it might be translated as then or therefore, or something like that. Translators in the ESV, I don't know what your translation reads, but the translators in the ESV have decided to translate that as but. And usually that's saved for a different form, which we're actually going to look at a little bit later in today's video. So it's typically not contrastive, but that does make logical sense. And even though it might not be a tremendously literal way to bring it in, or the most literal way to bring it in, it is capturing the sense that Jonah does something, and now the Lord's doing something. And that's actually a key element of this passage. One thing I did spend a little bit of time saying on the phrase "but the Lord" or "but God." If you've listened to other sermons, it's a pretty common, frequently made point, an important one, that a lot of times in the Bible, something's going wrong, something's happening, and then the Lord all of a sudden intervenes and changes everything. And there's a real pastoral element to that, in that what we see, what might be discouraging, well, God's doing great things behind the scenes. And when we see these interruptions like this, that's when that becomes very clear in the scripture and is something that's applicable in our lives as well. So, but God or but the Lord. And I spent a little bit of time on that in the exposition. You can dig into that more if you want. Now, it technically isn't quite but Yahweh. It's probably, like I said, more like then Yahweh intervened in this way. And of course, it's not God. It's the divine name, usually translated as Lord in most English translations. So you can lean on that as you will. I thought it was a reasonable point. I mean, God is intervening here, and he's doing it, even though it doesn't seem like for Jonah's good. He is actually doing it for Jonah's good. One point, the exegetical point, technical point that points to this even more, is that look what the first word is in our sentence here. It is the word Yahweh, as we mentioned. But then the verb follows it. The verb that is translated as hurl or throw down here follows it. And if you, depending upon your background in Hebrew syntax and exegesis, you may recall that typically the structure in biblical Hebrew, I don't think it's true for modern Hebrew, biblical Hebrew is it goes verb, subject, object. Whereas in English, it's subject, verb, object, as we see translated here. And the Hebrew matches, and I made some points about this in the exposition. I don't know if it was wise to bring it out in the actual sermon, but I think it's interesting and helpful to indicate that there's intentionally Yahweh has been moved to the front. Now, God, of course, is the center of everything, but that's not always the case syntactically or grammatically. And here the author is making it very clear that the focus is on Yahweh. And I think what that's doing is, and it's probably why the ESV translators translated it as contrastive or but, because everything was about Jonah primarily in the previous passage, at least grammatically. Now it's God is the actor. God is the chief actor grammatically here. And so his name has been moved to the beginning. As you see in both the English and the Hebrew, it's kind of lost in the English because the structure hasn't changed. This is the way we usually write things. But in the Hebrew, there's a change in word order. So that's important. And so you do want to emphasize probably to some degree that Yahweh is now the focus of the passage, and the word but might be helping in that regard too, even if that's not the most literal way to bring in the wa consecutive, as we mentioned. So what is Yahweh doing? He's hurling something. We're going to see that word again. We'll get to that when we get further along the passage. But this is throwing. I looked at some cross references you might want to look at. You might want to do a little bit more of a word study. But what we're trying to indicate here, and what the text is trying to indicate, is just how violent the storm is. So Yahweh throws something at the sea, like at and it's the word gadol again is here, right? The word gadol, we see that 14 times, I think, in the whole book. So we had the greatness of the city. Last time Nineveh was great. This time the great object is the storm. So it is a great storm, a great ruach. That's actually a word for spirit as well, but the wind there. And he threw it where? El Hayom, at the sea. So it's thrown at the sea. So that's a violent action. And then it goes on to say what this is. That this is a storm. At least as the gloss I have. If you look at the bottom for star, it could be also translated even as hurricane. So the ESV translates it as a tempest. When I think of tempest, I think a tempest in a teapot. So that makes it sound small to me, even though I know the analogy is making it sound like it should be a big thing. But in my mind, that's not the world's best word. Storm probably isn't the best word. Maybe hurricane, violent storm, something like that. But you do have the adjective. What type of tempest is it? It's a mighty tempest. And once again, the word gadol. So see gadol twice, different forms. They've tried to translate it as different words, as great here and mighty here. That's fine for diversity in the English, but keep in mind that is the same word. So it's the emphasis. This was really something big. And so it's giving this description of it being a great storm on the sea. So he hurls it. It's really powerful. This powerful, mighty wind. You can dig into that a little bit more in some cross references and the like. I did that myself in the exposition. And then it's a mighty storm, a mighty tempest, a hurricane, however you want to describe it. And then what happens here? It's talking about the ship, right? And what's the ship doing? Well, the ESV says it's threatened. It's threatened to break up. I think the King James is similar to that. You might have something slightly different in a different translation. But the word broken up is the right gloss, it looks like. You could probably translate it some slightly different ways. But this word here, hashev, which in this form, in a different format, means to ponder, consider, or think about. You see the gloss down there where they're saying threatened, and so it's that's fine. I think what's being captured in both cases is there's a personification of the ship, but I would say that this is worth digging into more. That's It's not just the ship threatened to break up as some sort of idiom. It's really personifying the ship and saying it's thinking. Right now, ships obviously, as we know, don't think. They can't think on their own. But it was is if the ship itself had the ability to think, and it's considering, it's saying, I'm essentially as good as destroyed. I'm as good as dead if it was a human. It's just this is just an overwhelming tempest. There's nothing that's going to save me, nothing that's going to save the mariners, nothing that's going to save Jonah. Well, we know all those things actually turn out the other way. The ship is so beleaguered that it looks like it's going to be destroyed. But the ship's spared, the mariners are spared, and the Jonah is eventually spared as well. So you can dig into that, lean into that a little bit. But I would just say that all these things just really emphasize how bad the storm is. And I did a poor job, and I don't know if it's how easy it is at all to emphasize what the writer is trying to convey. But Yahweh throws a storm. This is a great storm, and it's so bad the ship's about to fall apart, or thinks it's going to fall apart if it could think. So what's here in verse 4 is really just this emphatic idea that this is just a storm that exceeds anything any of us have probably ever experienced. Probably even though, like I said in the exposition that I gave, that's online on this channel as well, that it might have been a storm that exceeds any sort of Category 5 hurricane, just a divine storm of incredible might and power. And so I emphasized it maybe too much, but I mean the idea you want to have in your mind as you're reading through it and working through this, even for your own study, is that this is not just some storm. I mean, this is the storm of storms that's being brought upon the ship. And remarkably, in God's sovereignty, the ship itself actually did not break up, as we learn later on. Okay, well, let's move on to verse 5. Well, what's the result of all this? Well, you see the word then here, and you have this walk consecutive. So they're translating, at least in the ESV, they're translating that a little more literally here. And it makes perfect sense. There's no reason to use a different word. It's just consecutive. Okay, we have this terrible storm, and then what's happening? Well, we get into the mindset of the mariners, and they are afraid. My understanding is the word here for mariner, you can delve into a little bit more, is not a classically Hebrew word. There's some Aramaicisms in here, so you might want to dig into that a little bit, maybe even based upon the Phoenician language as well, that they were borrowing from that because of who were these people, the Phoenicians. And so I don't know if there's a much exegetical or much of exegetical gold there to bring out in an actual sermon, but something maybe for your background if you want to study more. I didn't go into it too much, but you'll see a few words like that, and I think they're found in this particular verse. So something potentially worth digging for your own benefit, but not tremendously helpful in the exposition. So what did they do? So they were very afraid. That's the natural result of the storm. I don't think there's too much to say more in the Hebrew about any of that I see in the structure. It comes out in the English pretty well, but the connection here that, hey, this is a terrible storm, and these guys aren't just afraid, they are terribly afraid, as we'll see. And what do? They are said to call out, this is the word for man, so they called each man called out unto his God. So something like each man calling to his God. And I think that's generally captured here. Each cried out to his God. Same idea. Might be a little bit more choppy if you just bring in literally from the Hebrew, which is why it's smoothed out a little bit. But what are they doing? They're calling out to their God. And I mean, the distinction here is that they are pagans. They're calling out to God. They don't know it's the real God, or they don't know Yahweh is behind this, but they're calling out to their idols, maybe even one idol. The sea god of the Phoenicians was, I believe, Yam. So you might want to dig into that. Maybe that's who they were calling out to. Each one were calling out to his God. Is it to individual gods with their own deities? Well, they're probably all Phoenicians, so it's probably not a bunch of different gods from different cultures, but they could be their pantheon of gods that they're calling out to, each one having different ones, or it could be each one's calling out to his god, being the same god that is Yam, the god of the sea. So that may be the case. You could explore that a little bit more, but the big, I guess, even application beyond exegetical point, the application point is that they're calling out to their God, while Jonah will just continuously ignore his own God, who is the true God. And what do they do here? This is the same word here, tol, that you see up here. So God hurls the wind, and they're going to hurl their cargo. So they're going to hurl the cargo, and they're going to throw it into the sea, El Chayam, as we see off the ship at the end of the verse, or at the end of this clause here. So there's hurling in both cases, there's throwing in both cases. And I think the point there, one is God's doing something and they're doing something, so it's a play on words. Eventually, they're going to hurl Jonah into the sea. But when we talk about the sailors, what are they doing? They're hurling into the sea to save themselves, and they're going to hurl Jonah eventually into the sea to save the ship, per his instructions later on. Well, is God bringing judgment? Yes, but he's also doing this to save Jonah, essentially, for Jonah's redemption. So there's something salvific in this word as it's being used in the book of Jonah, at least in chapter 1, that you might want to point out. And I think that's intentional. Like I said, I think the structure is very intentional in how the Hebrew author is using the language. And then they're throwing, it just says here pretty much objects, so there's nothing really specific here. But they're throwing what they have into the sea, into the sea. Now, once we mentioned before, well, initially our thought is that they're just kind of lightening the load, right? They're throwing cargo into the sea. Why are they throwing the cargo into the sea? To lighten the load, to maybe make it lighter, as it says here, in order for them to survive or have a better chance of surviving just this terrible storm. That might not be the case. For one thing, now, I get if you're in the middle of the storm, you're doing anything you can to try to save yourself, as minor as it might be. But if the storm is that bad, I don't know how much they would think actually lightening the weight of the ship is going to save them. I mean, it's the wind and the storm that's going to crush them, not so much that that's just too heavy. So that might be in their mind. We don't want to dig too deeply or be too speculative. However, remember, what are they doing? They're crying out to their gods. They're crying out to, however we understand this, their god or their gods. And it may be that this is an act of sacrifice, right? It's not so much practical. It's that they're throwing something into the water that, hey, we'll give this to you, Yam, as a sacrifice. And if you're appeased by this, by the sacrifice that we make, maybe you'll stop the storm. So it's part of the religious act as a possibility. You can dig into that a little bit more. I think both might be in play. Now, you might say, well, they're trying to lighten it for them. Doesn't that indicate that's more practical? Well, the word here, when they throw it into the sea, to lighten. Now, the gloss here is lighten. You can do a word study yourself into this a little bit more, but it might have more of a religious connotation. It could refer to appeasing rather than lightening. So now we're thinking it as it's brought into English, it's lightening the weight of the ship, but it might be lightening something else. And that is the burden or the offense to Yam, the offense to the sea god as they see it. So maybe appeasing rather than lightening. Once again, you can dig into the word study a little bit more and see what you think about that. But that would be pretty consistent with their religious act, and it would make more sense, at least logically, than just trying to lighten the ship in the middle of this divine storm, and something they recognize is a divine storm as well. Well, what about friend Jonah? If you look here, we have here I mentioned earlier. There's different forms with the vav. This is the vav consecutive. When you have the schwa underneath it instead of the vowel pointing that we saw, it is a wa correlative. A wa correlative is a correlation is taking place, and usually that's going to be translated as and or but. And in this case, it is contrastive. So but is the best word to bring in. So it's but Jonah. Jonah's doing something else. So while all this is going on, Jonah's in his own world, right? What did Jonah do? He has gone down into the hold or the middle of the ship. One thing I'd point out here as well, grammatically, that is important or helpful, perhaps, is it says had gone down. Now, in language terminology, we call that a pluperfect. A pluperfect. You might remember that, especially if you took Greek. That's one of the forms. It's not used very often. In fact, when I took Greek, we went all through all the forms of the perfect, the imperfect. Our professor just skipped the pluperfect because it's so rare in the Greek New Testament. So I mean, and in English, it comes down as had gone down. So I had done something. I did in the past, but it has sort of like present ramifications, I guess, might be the best way to describe it. So if I had done something, and what that indicates is that that happened, as we mentioned, in the past, right? He's already down there. Well, look at the word here. I don't know if you can see in the bubble. It's the call and katal form, and I don't know what your Hebrew level of Hebrew was, and just even basic Hebrew, but the katal is perfect, right? Now, there's a lot of range that you can get from these words. It's not like Greek where it's quite as specific, but generally that just means it's a normal verb, and so there's no reason that we're required to translate this as had gone down as if it's pluperfect or it happened in the past with any ramifications for the present. It could be just translated, but Jonah went down or is going down even into the inner part of the ship. Now it's kind of awkward phrasing, but that could be the sense that all this is going on, and what Jonah do? He went down to the inner part of the ship, and then he laid down. This is also sort of in the pluperfect as well, but it's not required to be in that format. And the point of all that isn't to just be super technical about the language, it's to say this could have happened somewhat concurrently. Now we know Jonah initially was down in the part of the ship. So did he come up at some point? I don't know. That's not text doesn't bear that out, but it could be he was aware of what was going on. He was awake already, and he just decided he was going to go down to sleep while all this was going on, because maybe he realized that, hey, Yahweh's come for him, nothing else to do but sleep and maybe die in my sleep or something like that. So this isn't forced here grammatically. Maybe what happened, it may have been that he was already down there sleeping while this is going on. After all, he was in a deep sleep or a fast sleep, as the text tells us. Jonah may have done that somewhat concurrently, and so something to consider, something to bring out, maybe something to research a little bit more. But what that would do is that would explain why the captain seems to be so incensed here. Now, maybe just finding him sleeping may have been enough for him to have this reaction. But if he knew Jonah was awake and then just decided to go to bed, I mean, how much more confounding would that be if all this is going on, the guy just decides to go to sleep while everyone else is trying to save himself? So worth digging into, worth considering, worth even bringing out in exposition. But I'll leave that to you as to how you want to follow up with that. He has lied down, as we said. That's not necessarily in the pluperfect, and he's in this deep sleep. You can do a word study on this and look at some comparative passages. And what I saw, I think, with Abraham and others, is that that's the word that's used here, usually for the deep sleep that God would put a person into when he's going to give them a vision or something. So that kind of indicates how tremendous of a sleep it is. Some commentators even point out it's like a sleep almost onto death, like he's practically dead, and that might have some symbolism. So I didn't bring that out. You might want to. Once again, like I said, you don't want to lean too much on small things that are particularly debatable, but it can be helpful in giving your people an understanding of just what's going on here. This isn't just a normal nap, right? This is something really specific that's being called out about just how unengaged Jonah is, however you want to understand it and how you want to convey that to your people. Okay, so the captain comes down and says to him, "What do you mean, you're a sleeper?" and you sleeper. And I think the only thing, I don't think there's too much grammatically here going on that you necessarily want to bring out to your people that's going to be tremendously helpful, at least as I see it. A little bit's used on this phrase ma lake, but I don't think that's too important other than for your own benefit. But the word kum, however, is, because what is this word? This word is the word for arise. And if we go all the way back up to verse 2, forgive me for scrolling a little bit, what do we see here? Kum. So the captain's saying the same thing to Jonah, and as God told him, and Jonah is no more interested in obeying the captain, really, as we'll see, than he was in obeying God. He does eventually arise, as the text will continue in the next passage, but he never calls out to his God, as he's told to do here, to call out to your God. Um, the language here is pretty straightforward. It's Elohim again. The word up there is also Elohim for their gods, even though they're not real gods. And he's kind of talking in the general sense, call out to your God. I think the ESV does a good job keeping that in the lowercase. Yes, he's going to call out, he's told to call out to Yahweh, but the captain doesn't know that. From his perspective, it's just another God. And then this word perhaps is down here. It's actually in the Hebrew. So I think that's a good thing that English captures, because he's unsure. He's saying, hey, maybe our God, calling out to God, our gods clearly isn't working. Maybe your God will give us a thought to us, so that we will not perish. And so I don't think there's much more in the Hebrew or in the structure. I don't think there's much more background to bring into any of this here, but hopefully our analysis was helpful, and there's some key points that you can dig in a little more for your people, for your own edification, and hopefully even the structure elements of the structure I was able to point out has put you on a good track of better understanding the text and seeing a lot of detail that's in here. So look forward to continuing this, and pray this is a blessing in your study. And so Lord bless you, and as you prepare to teach your people or just to learn more about the scripture itself. Amen.